Okay, we are recording. Okay. First of all, I want to thank José for accepting my invitation to be here today and present his talk to all of us. And also I want to thank all the fellows and organizational team for joining us today. I was not prepared to do this introduction, but so I will read a little bit, please don't mind. So José is a musician and researcher. He has authored several research outputs, including the books Jazz in Europe, Networking and Negotiation Identities, Festa do Jazz, and Women and Jazz, European Perspectives from Researchers and Artists, as editor. That's in print by Routledge. His research spans European cultural networks, women representation in the music industry, and practice research in improvised music. Both academic circles and industry sectors have recognized his positive contributions across various disciplines. These include film music, practice research, community-led participatory research, improvisation, new jazz studies, cultural studies, gender studies, ethnomusicology, and European culture policies. And about today's seminar, this presentation will explore how dialogic ethnography and participatory research can assist in investigating established narratives, both at the official and grassroots levels. José is a professor at the Coventry University, and he was doing various researches on different subjects. So I'm not going to talk about his presentation today more because he will tell us all about. But before he starts, I just want to tell you that José and I come from a kind of similar professional background. We are both jazz musicians, composers, and researchers. And that means that we use our practice, music, for a ground for the research, and we use various methodologies to do that, various scientific methodologies to do that, which makes our practice transdisciplinary. And I know that not many of you are into arts, but I still hope that you will find this approach interesting and inspiring for your further researches. José and I know each other from one collaboration we did together. As I mentioned, he did this huge volume for Routledge about European jazz in women, and I was invited to contribute to that volume, which I was very happy to do. And we met personally last year, first time at the Rhythm Changes conference in Graz, which is one of the biggest annual jazz research conferences in Europe, and hopefully we will meet again this August at the same conference but in Amsterdam, where I will also present some of the results of this research I'm doing for this fellowship. So I will please gather some questions and comments during this presentation so we can open the discussion after José's presentation. So I give the microphone over to José, please enjoy.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I browsed through the profiles of the fellows, and it seemed really incredible people working there from different areas. And as Jasna said, we are artists. We have a different approach to what we want to find out. We use our artistic practice to understand better the world around us. But that's the only difference. The research questions are the same, or could sort of resonate with some of your research questions. The methodologies vary a little bit, but the way you go about those methodologies can also be interesting for some of you. I don't think I'm wrong. I believe I saw that some of you are working, or most of you are working about issues around Europe, Europe identity. Part of my research, as you'll see, explores peripheral Europe, and I understand that this is a group that is focused on one periphery of Europe. So we have that in common. I'm Portuguese, so I also belong to the periphery on the other side. And I'm now living in a country which is very, very peripheral, as you know, with Brexit. So we'll cover those issues. And please stop me at any time. You know, just feel free. It's good to create a dialogue. Start sharing my presentation and see how it goes. Let me just pull this up. Okay, you can all see this, can't you? Yeah. Okay, it's good. Okay, so the title of today's talk is Dialogic, Ethnography and Participatory Research. And this is a way that I decided, after many attempts with different methodologies, to try to understand how we could challenge established narratives, in this case, in the music industry. But again, those issues around the music industry are global, so they can apply to any of your research. So my research is sort of span through different branches, 3 different branches. The first one is European jazz festivals and networks. The second one, and not necessarily in this order, the second one on popular music, genders and sexualities, and the third one on music composition and improvisation for screen. Now, the research questions behind these sort of branches, as I said, could relate to some of your research. The first one, in the end, what I want to understand is what is Europe, which is a very elusive field, Europe, and what does it mean to be European? And I'll explore a bit each one of these branches. The second one, how are women represented in the music industry? And the third one, how can communities regain ownership over their own collective memory? So the first big question of the first branch is, what is Europe? And I guess you came across this in your own research. One of my books is exactly about this. What is Europe through the eyes of jazz and jazz practices in Europe? I remember that Madeleine Albright, she was the Secretary of State for, I believe, Bill Clinton. And she used to say that in order to understand Europe, you would have to be either a genius or French. You know, she was joking about how complicated Europe is. And in fact, it's a very complicated subject. And what does it mean to be European? Again, in my case, through the perspective of being a European jazz musician. So what I did, and usually my approach is span over 3 steps, or 3 main steps. I started by analyzing the discourse. So the official discourse that comes from the European Union, from each country, from other pan-European institutions on what is Europe through the eyes of jazz. So to you might seem a bit puzzling, but there is an official discourse, for instance, in the European Union about what jazz is, what European jazz is. And through that, we can understand a little bit of what the idea of Europe is. So that was the first step, analyzing the discourse. The second one, analyzing the narratives, so the ground level and the sectors, by engaging in conversations, in dialogue with musicians, festivals, higher education in jazz in Europe, which is very strong, promoters and so on. So it was basically a long ethnography where I had different conversations with different actors in these sectors about what for them European jazz is and what Europe is. And then, after sort of juxtaposing the discourse and the ground narratives, I introduced my own practice. So I started performing, collaborating with musicians such as Jasna and others, not in this case, but we will in the future, I'm sure. And my interest there was mainly into understanding the social interactions and the cultural dynamics between musicians who are from different European countries. So what I was interested there was to try to understand how these people collaborated and what was unique about the collaboration between European musicians from different countries. So the first step in analyzing discourse, I came across very hilarious descriptions of what jazz is or use of jazz in the official discourse. This, for instance, is from the Spanish presidency of the European Union in 2010, the first semester. And what happened there was that in Madrid, there was a very small venue, which was part actually of a public school. And it was sort of a tradition that they would have jazz concerts there in the spring, but nothing official. It was a very small venue. And because the Spanish, they took the presidency of the European Union, and one of the ways to promote that presidency was to develop some cultural events. They decided to promote that very small venue to an Euro Jazz Festival 2010. And of course, they had to create a discourse to justify why all of a sudden that very small venue and those small concerts became an Euro Jazz Festival. So what they say is that the Euro Jazz Festival aims to relate the language of jazz with the cultural identity of Europe, which is a bit vague, but again, gives us an idea of how jazz, other art forms, other kinds of music, film, dance, anything, or even outside the art forms, that can be used as sort of this white canvas that doesn't mean anything. It's a bit meaning neutral. It doesn't mean anything. So you can project in it whatever you want. This is another example. This is from the cultural program of the EU, 2007-2013. The world of jazz, Europe's mixing of cross-fertilization of cultures, the positive impact of migration patterns on Europe's culture, and so on. So this is what they were, how they were describing jazz. And of course, this was to align with what was on the agenda, the European Union across these 7 years, which was very much to think about migration, think about the cross-fertilization of cultures. So again, jazz becomes this sort of metaphor for the EU's agenda in this case. This for me is the funniest one. So Belgium also took the European presidency in 2001. This is an old one, but you can see that whomever wrote this was struggling to find a link between jazz and their country, which in this case is Belgium. So the way they found to link jazz and Belgium was with this. So before anyone grumbles at Belgium's boring credentials, ask yourself where Charlie Parker or John Coltrane would have been without Adolphe Sax, the Belgian who invented the saxophone. So in a way, what they're saying is we don't have any links with jazz, which is not true. Belgium has a very vibrant jazz scene and free jazz scene, mostly in Ghent, which is a city where there's amazing musicians and amazing venues. But because this person didn't know, the only connection he found, or they found, was, well, we invented the saxophone and there's great saxophone players in the history of jazz. So again, it's trying sometimes almost desperately to find a link between an art form and an agenda. There's others, but this will be shared. The the presentation will be shared, so you can take a look into other examples. Okay, then I took a look into the narratives. I started talking with colleagues, other musicians, promoters, festival directors, people ahead of jazz courses across Europe. And this is a musician, Portuguese musician, a bass musician. And he said something like, currently, you no longer think about settling a career in your own country first and then try Europe. Today, you can already think of it as a whole. So he was very much trying to give this idea and to align his narrative with the official discourse that, yes, this is all about mobility. I'm a new musician and I engage completely with that agenda. I'm not criticizing the agenda. On the contrary, I'm just analyzing scientifically what people said. This is Marcus Oder, and he still works for BBC Radio 3, which has some jazz in its programming. And we were at one jazz festival, 12 Points, which is this festival where each night they have 3 different artists, and it goes for 4 nights, so it's 12 different artists from 12 different European countries. And it's called 12 Points because it sort of reminds us of the Eurovision Song Contest, so because it's the maximum amount of points. So, and it's usually young talent, so young musicians from, I don't know, Estonia and Croatia and different countries. And he was doing the coverage for this for BBC, and we talked, and he said something like this: I think that for jazz in Europe today, events like 12 Points, that Inter-European Jazz Festival, help create a sort of cohesion, a pan-European something. And I like this something because he doesn't know himself. I don't know. No one knows. So you start to understand that Europe is this kind of thing, this kind of myth, if you want. Again, a white canvas where you can project different things. So what I gather from this is that both jazz and Europe are kind of ideals that are a bit neutral value assets to which we can then project ideals, political agendas, ideologies, political preferences, and so on. So in this course, we have this idea of, that jazz in Europe is integration, multiculturalism, diplomacy, external economy. Yes, there was someone who was saying that jazz is the best way to promote, European jazz is the best way to promote European products in the Far East. So, there's people saying things like that. Of regional identity, for instance, there's this case of an Italian jazz musician who I won't name because Jasna would know, that in his promotional tour, whenever he was playing inside Italy, he would say that, well, his music is really the music from Perugia, which is a region in Italy. When he was playing abroad in Europe, he would say that this is really the sound of Italian jazz. When he was playing outside Europe, he would promote himself as someone who really represents the sound of European jazz. So musicians themselves also sort of align their narrative, even for promotional aims, with the official discourse. So there's this idea that jazz is value neutral music. It's the voice of the common man, which is a very old concept. A platform for acceptance, which is also debatable, which promotes freedom of expression, which exists beyond political borders. It's a universal language, which isn't true, and promotes dialogue, and so on and so on. In my practice, what I saw performing with these musicians and collaborating with them is that we are constantly negotiating our identities and our different peripheralities, our musical identities, our European identities, national, regional, whatever. We are constantly negotiating our identities. Jazz is is a good platform to do that because it's improvised music, so it's very flexible. It is constructed in a way that lives and feeds up by the contribution of different people. So it's almost very easy to see this in jazz, and probably easier than, for instance, with a symphonic orchestra, let's say. But that's the good thing about jazz, and that's why I could do this via my practice research. About peripheralities, I'll speak a bit about that. But the idea of what Europe is came across from this research as a cultural network. So it's above all a network of cities, and if you look at the history of Europe, it has sort of grown that way. If you look at Europe in the Middle Ages, Europe was sort of a network of cities. People didn't think much about the nation or realms, or they thought about key cities. Lisbon was one key city. Florence was another key city, and so on and so on. So it was a network of cities, and today is still a network of cities. So it's a cultural network above all. And it's an idealized construction. So it's basically the model of democracy that we want. And looking at the times we live in today, you see how this is negotiated constantly. Is Europe a political bloc? Is Europe an economical bloc? Is Europe a cultural bloc? Is Europe a military bloc? So we're constantly reshaping what Europe is, and sort of trying to find an identity. And what does it mean to be European? So what I saw was that there's different levels of peripherality. Like I said, geographically, I belong to a peripheral country, and I now live in another peripheral country. All Southern European countries are peripheral. And you can see that, by the way, how the EU sometimes refers to these countries, the idea that they don't like to work, they just spend money. Here in the UK, and I live now here for 10 years, so I arrived just before Brexit, a year before Brexit. And one of the first things that puzzled me was the fact that I didn't see any EU flags anywhere. So you go around Europe and you see EU flags all around, right? In the public buildings, I don't know, hospitals, where even universities, when there's a flag, a national flag, there's a European Union flag, and here, none. So that was a bit puzzling. So the UK always felt very, very much far away from Europe or the EU. It's something that it's very far away. There's this story when in the 1950s, the UK, mostly London, they had a big crisis, and many people died actually, because they had a heating crisis. So they started to burn more wood in their houses, and the air became a bit unbreathable. And that smoke column sort of went into the channel, the English channel. So they couldn't get stuff from Europe. So there was also a lack of food, medicines, all the things they imported from Europe. They had big issues. And the Times at the time, the first page read, "Europe isolated from the UK." So, this idea that the UK is the center and Europe is sort of peripheral to the UK is very much prevalent here. But also Ireland, also the Scandinavian countries, right? They're also different from Europe. Norway, for instance, is not in the EU, is part of the EU, but with a special sort of partnership. And so there's a geographical peripherality, which as a musician, I identify in my music. I play in a different way that people from France, people from other countries play. The fact that I'm peripheral geographically also makes me, in the case of Portugal, peripherally, economically peripheral. So I don't have as much access to money as people in the center of Europe or the north of Europe. So there's all sorts of layers there. But what I found was that when you go to the center of Europe and you start performing with these musicians from the center of Europe, they also see themselves as peripheral, because jazz is a peripheral music and improvised music is a peripheral music. So again, being European is negotiating your identity. Either you are by nature peripheral geographically, or if you want to become peripheral inside Europe. Yes, so that was the first branch. The second one, the question behind it was, how are women represented in the music industry? Of course, this is a very, very bad research question. I'm jumping steps, but for the sake of economy, we'll just go on with this. But again, three steps or three main steps in the research. The first, we wanted to make an assessment of the representation of women in the music industry. We looked at good practice, so success cases, and then we applied variations of those success cases. So this was a study that I did with women musicians in São Paulo, Brazil. And this is the pre-practice research that we did, and we got to these numbers. So, for instance, 76% of women don't have children; those work in music. In Brazil, women only retain 9% of the total revenue of the music industry, when we know that there's at least a 50-50 split in terms of who's performing. In Brazil, 60% of women in music say that parenting and domestic responsibilities are the greatest obstacle to perform their job. And 84% of women in music say they have been discriminated against for being a woman. So this was the quantitative and qualitative research, how we started. Also, we tried to understand how things were going on around the world. This is British news. So in that particular year, Glastonbury, which is the largest popular music festival here in the UK, all the headliners were male, and that raised issues for the first time, raised issues. And from France, we had this amazing musician, bass player, a veteran now, who wrote a letter to Les Victoires du Jazz, which is the awards in France for jazz musicians, and where she raised the issue that in the 16 categories they had, you know, best performer, best sax player, best trumpet player, best record, and so on. The 16 categories they had, and each one of these categories has 4 nominees. None were women, not even in jazz vocals, which is traditional, more female. So Joël Léandre, this amazing bass player, wrote an open letter to Les Victoires to address this. And then we took a look into good success cases. There's around Europe, mainly around Europe, jazz festivals that are specifically for women musicians. The EU promotes European culture abroad also through jazz. So sometimes they pay commissions to European musicians to play abroad. And this one's very interesting because the EU decided to take two women, so the headliners were women, and on top of the performances, they also offered master classes. So in a country where there at the time and still there is some sort of issues around gender equality and women representation in society, a very discreet but very effective way the European Union managed to address that was to say, well, if you want to learn jazz, here are some women who can teach you, which was very intelligent. And then, of course, there's the Key Change Pledge or Manifesto, which is a pledge that some jazz festivals in Europe, I would say most by now, have signed, and which says basically that all programming in jazz festivals in Europe should have a 50-50 split of female and male artists on stage. So we took all of these good examples, and what we decided to do was also in collaboration with the participants to understand how we could promote their own narrative. How could they be a bit more empowered over their own narrative and how they could promote themselves. Brazil is still a very traditional country in many cases, and what regards the role of women in society, very traditional. So we needed to address some of these issues. What we decided to do was to give these 12 women, and these 12 women were from completely different music genres. You had women that perform mainly classical music, experimental, popular music, traditional music. So we decided to give them training on how to do their own EPKs. And EPK is what we musicians sometimes use when we want to promote ourselves, when there's an album release, when there's a tour soon. EPK stands for Electronic Press Kit. Sorry. So basically, it's a kit that we hand to the media with videos, audio samples, press releases, and so on. And in this case, we, not ourselves personally, but we had someone providing training to these women so that they could do their own videos for the EPK. Unfortunately, I didn't subtitle this, and it's in Portuguese, which is a beautiful language. But I'll just give you an idea of what happens in these videos. So basically, they curated everything about the video, how they wanted, how much of talk they wanted, how much of performance they wanted, how they wanted to be represented on screen, the topics. So they curated all of that. And in this case, this is Rosa, a multi-instrumentalist. And well, she's talking about something interesting. Another interesting thing about this study was that also in Brazil, there's a big gap between white and black musicians, well, all around the society. And for instance, when you spoke with white musicians, how did you start? You're interested in music, and they would say, well, when I was 5, my dad bought me a piano, stuff like that. And then you have people like Rosa who say, well, I had to wait until I was 21 to see a non-government organization come into the slum where I lived to hand me an instrument, and then I could start playing and performing. So really different realities, which are also associated with the gender gap. So she decides to talk a bit about that, and then she performs a bit. And she decided which music she wanted to perform. The music is also about being a woman in São Paulo. So we thought that this was a very good way of empowering women and allowing them to control a bit more their own narrative. There was also an industry report, which we distributed to schools, public schools in São Paulo. And when I say we, mostly the participants, we we were extensively interviewed for Brazilian media, which was very good to bring awareness to the project. So basically, the assessment, we started with self-awareness. Again, some of the musicians, the oldest musicians, they would say, no, I was never a victim of harassment. But when they started to tell their stories, yes, they were, much more than the younger musicians are now. So it's a way of gaining self-awareness of your own circumstance. And we did this through focus groups. Then the good practice, we took those formal women support systems. One of the issues in Brazil is that there's lots of people with goodwill and want to do lots of things, but then they don't organize themselves into formal organizations, manifestos, and very important also, we brought some international weight to the cause, because in a way we were saying, listen, this is happening in Europe, you guys can do the same thing here. And then the practice, so the idea of strengthening numbers, so these women became sort of ambassadors of the cause in their own networks, of empowering these people, of using their multiple skills, and finally gaining ownership over their own representation. And I'm going to the last one. I know that I'm probably going a bit too long, but I'll promise I'll be brief. This one, which is an even worse research question because it jumps lots of steps. How can communities regain ownership over their own collective memory? Of course, we did extensive research trying to understand if communities own their collective memory or not. And we asserted that not. And again, 3 major steps. So we started by working with the BBC archive, news archive about Coventry, which is where I work. So the BBC used to shoot in mute, so they didn't record the sound. And all of those reels are in an archive called MACE, which is the Midlands archive for film. So we went there and tried to see which pieces of news were from Coventry. And it was very important that it was mute, because we could then add the sound, the voices we wanted to those images. Then we did workshops with the communities in identifying misrepresentation in those reels. And then we performed something that was created collectively. So I'll show you one of the videos that we showed the communities. And this one is this one really triggered lots of discussion, because it's from 1961, and it's called Coventry's Slums. And the thing that everyone flags is the fact that you can't see faces. So it's about the poverty in Coventry, but it's like a faceless poverty. So take a look into it. It's very, very short, doesn't have any sound. The only people you see are very further away from the camera, but you can see that people live in these houses. There's clothes hanging there to dry. There's a cat. Where there's cat, there's people. There's a kid playing there, but you can't see his face. And it's all about, there's people belongings, but you can't see the face of poverty. And that was something that was raised, for instance, amongst other things. So what we did then was these sort of workshops where we would show these clips, and people would sort of discuss them and say, no, this is not what happened, or yes, this happened, but now it's completely different. And we did this in 2 major workshops, or series of workshops. One, the first image to your left, is at the university in Coventry. That colleague there who's leading the workshops is my colleague from Warwick University, which is just across the road. And we did also in a couple of care homes with the elder residents of Coventry. And then we took notes of what they said, we recorded what they said, and myself, together with two musicians, a VJ would control the videos and sort of manipulate the videos, and a spoken word artist, a poet from Coventry. We collected that feedback and we created something and gave it back to the community. This is a very short video of that.
We had spent sunny summers in Broadgate's grass square, under Lady Godiva's statue, sitting on a horse bare. And we had watched the people hustle in a pedestrianised bustle, sprinting to the precinct, to the Lion Cafe, sipping drinks.
So yeah, this is a very short version of what happened. But in the main, what we took as positive from the experience was the fact that we work with the stakeholders, for instance, MACE, in co-curating what we would show the communities. And that led them to reflect about their own archive, what they have in their archive, and their role in the community. What are we supposed to show the community? How are we supposed to show how they looked like? So that was a very interesting discussion. In identifying misrepresentations, it was very interesting to see that the memory, the collective memory, was also negotiated, and especially in care homes where sometimes memory becomes a bit blur. What comes out of it is a negotiated memory. Like, oh, that wasn't there in that street, it was on that street. So, you know, stuff like that. Or, as you probably heard in the poem that the Navkira, the poet, was reading, it's about how they remember the past and how better it was in some aspects when compared to the present. And something very interesting as well, they were evoking family and community ties, which in a way brings history back to life. And finally, this idea of creating collectively was also very interesting because they curated the sounds, the words, the images with us. There was a scrutiny of representation. So they were there. They said, no, 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 take out that image. We think this one is more representative. And also something that is very close to my heart, the fact that we were building together. We were not consuming together. So, and you know, consumerism, as we well know, leads to isolation, individualism. So we're building together. We were creating a sense of community. And I swear that I'm almost finished. So across all this, I use dialogic ethnography. Again, I will leave the presentation for you so that you can see all those amazing quotes much better than I can ever define what dialogic ethnography is. But the main advantage to dialogic ethnography is that we allow the participants to pose questions. With surveys, semi-structured interviews, and those more traditional methods, you put the respondent, the participant, in a passive position where they can only respond to what you're saying. In the case of a dialogue, a conversation, it's assumed that questions can come from both sides. And from my experience, the questions they pose tell you much more than the responses they give you. Then there's the participatory research, and the fact that they are participating in the research allows them to gain ownership over their narratives. Like I said, they are sort of scrutinizing the way in which they are represented also in research. So overall, this allows us researchers to access elements otherwise hard or impossible to reach. For instance, what their emotions are, feelings of abandonment or belonging. Even if you do a survey and you ask, do you feel like you belong to this community? They can say either yes or no. That tells us nothing. Even if you give them 50 words to develop that idea, that will hardly tell you much more. So this idea that the participants indeed take part in the research will allow us to see their emotions. And this is something that I very recently became aware of. I'm sure that all of us have put in their bids for funding that our research bridges the gap between academia and ground actors. But does it really? Because what I felt is that only from the moment when I started working directly with communities and having them in a position where they are owners of their own narrative, that's the first moment I felt, yes, finally I'm bridging the gap between academia and the ground actors, because I'm no longer this person in an ivory tower surrounded by books that no one wants to read, dictating them what they are. We are building together. We are negotiating their own identity together. Like Jasna very kindly said, I got 2 books out. There's this is what the last few things I put out. There's one when Jasna has this amazing chapter on her own practice. It's Women in Jazz, European Perspectives from Female Researchers and Artists. I'm the only man in the team, so everything was made so that, again, the participants, in this case, the authors and the interviewees, would gain ownership over their own narratives. There's a monograph coming out in 2027. And then there's a few articles. Those who are interested in issues relating to European identity, cultural policies, and so on, there's a book chapter on the Oxford Handbook of Jazz and Political Economy coming soon, well, in November. And those of you interested in gender imbalance, there's also a few things over there. If you want to see a bit more of my research or music, you can go to my website, josediasmusic.com. If you want to send me a direct email, there's the email address. Or if you want just to link, just use LinkedIn. And yeah, and thank you. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm really sorry.
No, it didn't took too long. Jose, thank you very much. Tina, should I take it over now? Okay. Jose, thank you so much. I don't know about the others. As I said, maybe not too many people are coming from the arts here, but I hope it was interesting for all of you too. For me, I'm so excited because I just realized we do have a lot in common in our research. So I have like 5 pages written down here while you were talking with questions, but we might take another round with that. And I see that I think that being a jazz musician and being a researcher, it requires you to be and work with community, which is, I think, very nice. And all of your projects mirror that we are involved in community actively. As musicians and researchers, I think that's maybe the first thing about jazz, that we do belong to community and we can't avoid that. We can't stay away from that. Jose, I will start. I hope that others can jump in too. I have a lot of questions and comments, but I will be very brief. What I'm was very interested in, and because I'm doing this research here as a fellow, about the migration of Balkan female musicians to Western Europe, and it's a lot about identity. You see, you were mentioning peripheral identity, European identity, local, regional music, social identity. I am so very interested in trying to figure this out as well. And what I wanted to say that, you know, I also work with now with the same approach with the dialogic ethnography. So I am interviewing different female players from Balkan countries. But you see, saying Balkan is also a big word. Balkan means in Europe different kind of identity as well, you can imagine. And so I am interviewing some women from Croatia, some women from Serbia, and you know, if they who are living in Western Europe. So if they're Croatian, they would say everywhere in the websites, or it's just an example, a Croatian musician, but Serbian would not say that, because you see, it's very interesting. Croatia might be semi-peripheral, but we are definitely peripheral Serbian. So it's also an interesting way of representation of our identities in Europe, you know, different countries, because Croatia is in European Union, Serbia is not. You know, so I find this very interesting, and I read a few articles about hyper identities. So I'm thinking about this, you know, being in jazz. What is our identity? And you were saying a lot of migration and finding this oneness as a European jazz identity, which is hardly, it's utopian, but it's okay. What I want to ask you is that I'm now researching about different identities. So if these women are living in Western Europe, you know, and then still searching for some identity, we always want to identify. So what would be your take of, if I can say, if I don't want to be, if I don't have national identity, how about genre identity in jazz? For example, you know, we identify differently. Oh, I am an avant-garde musician. Oh, I am a mainstream. Oh, and then because in this research, what I do, I don't talk about national identity with these women. I talk about, okay, let's put out your partituras and your scores and your recorded music, and let's analyze your music and see your identity, political, social, national, through your scores. So bringing this, searching for identity through musical content, taking in concern the genre, but also reading the national, the gender identity, or a political or social identity. I don't know if it's clear. I just said too much. So,
what I've seen, and what I think you've seen as well, and Marie Buscato, this amazing researcher from Sorbonne,
yeah.
She observed that there's more and more women migrating from traditional jazz to avant-garde jazz or free jazz, because they're more included. Yeah. So there's something about free jazz that it's not just free from traditional structures in the music, it's also free from social structures and hierarchies and so on and so on. And that, again, I think it's a good metaphor for what happens in other sectors in life and industry, where women might feel more welcome in different ways of operating. Exactly the same thing. I mean, what we do in free jazz is very similar to what other musicians do with traditional jazz, or even with repertoire music. But the way we approach the practices is very different, in a way that it's not just about this sort of void idea that we respect everyone. The music doesn't exist if we don't respect everyone. So it's a fundamental characteristic of the music, and it involves the social practices, and it involves challenging the hierarchies and so on and so on. So when I look at your work, for instance, I see that you're challenging these hierarchies, and again, you're negotiating a model where women can feel more included, they can feel safe, which is also a very important aspect, and where they can be leaders in their own right. So I think these ideas of migration, belonging, challenging narratives is applicable not only in jazz, of course, but it's applicable in a tech company, in a university, in a research project. So, you know, if we could look into these, and jazz is just one example, these good examples, and if we could try to understand what's going there in terms of social dynamics, and then replicate that or be inspired by that in other social systems, you know, that I think that's beneficial. I probably reply to your question because I have that thing where I don't reply to things. I always failed the question.
No. I got it out what I need, and I will now stop talking about jazz because maybe other people are not interested in that. But I just want to say something, and maybe that can open the discussion with the others. Dialogic ethnography, I use that too. I find it's a marvelous, beautiful, community-based methodology in research. And I just want to make a comment on that. I was doing the interview with 18 ex-Yugoslavian female musicians, the same way you were mentioning. And a lot of them started the conversation with, oh, no, I'm not a female musician, I'm a musician. I don't want to be called a woman. I don't want to play on a female festivals. I don't want to be, exceptional, and so on and so on. But then through asking questions, through group interviews, there was this, what you said, the self-awareness came up, and they were changing their opinions. They were starting to think, and then I was following them up for 1-2 years. They changed their practices, the way they're thinking, the way they're socially positioning themselves. And then, so I call also this a way of a methodology, activist research. I don't know if you will agree with me, and maybe that can open a further discussion about maybe activist research, how we as researchers can actually change things with our methodologies.
I can start because I have a very strong opinion on that. I think that especially in the humanities, which I think it's the case of most here, it is our job to do agency as well. You know, you don't ask if a health researcher is finding a way to make cancer even more deadly. So why would you ask someone from the humanities not to improve their community? So agency is part of our job. It's our obligation to make agency.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know if anybody of you who are present here want to jump in or give some comment or opinion. That would be fantastic.
And I would like to know, you know, some of you.
Me too. Hi, yeah.
Should I go?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for a great presentation. I think I'm totally not qualified to comment. I just enjoyed it. I'm an economist. But what I wanted to ask you maybe is, do you in your research, have you had or do you have ideas in your research to collaborate with maybe not so, let's say, close disciplines? I would say, I feel like, you know, for instance, in innovation research, we know from an economic perspective, we know that the best breakthroughs and patents even come when totally distant industries come together. I was wondering, in your industry, in the music industry, is there any kind of non-obvious industry you're collaborating with, either practically or in terms of research? I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, I am. So Coventry University Coventry is sort of the capital of the auto industry in the UK. It's where we have Jaguar, Land Rover, all those brands. And we do have a partnership with Jaguar and Land Rover. So our PGR students, our postgraduate students, they are the ones, when you enter a Jaguar or Land Rover, when you turn on the car, the sounds you hear were designed by our students and by us. And this was a partnership which is very much participatory as well, because the students, and I say students because they did most of the job, we just collected the benefits, but they did most of the job. It's part of their research to position themselves, in the buyer of the car, but also as the child behind, and also as the person sitting next to the driver. And this seems very, very simple, but it's not, because that raises very important issues. For instance, one of the students, a male student, was saying, well, yes, I'm a driver. What about my wife? And a female researcher, a female student, she said, wow, why can't I be the driver and the person next to me is the husband, or even another woman? So, and that raised really interesting questions. I'm not saying that completely changed the design of Jaguar and Land Rover, but what I'm saying is that it made them think about these issues. And probably even Jaguar and Rover, they started rethinking the way in which they design their marketing, for instance, right? So yeah, it's a bit lateral to what you asked, but I think it's an idea of what can go on.
No, it's a great example. Yeah, I didn't know that, so it's a great example. Thank you.
We have Amina who wants to maybe raise a question or comment, please.
Thanks so much, Jasna, and Jose, thank you so much for this presentation. I really appreciated your take on jazz in Europe, sharing narratives as being intercultural and peripheral, and striving to sort of set certain forms of shared values and commonality and collectivity. And at the same time, I had questions as a race scholar of transnationalism and migration. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about complexities behind the jazz as, I don't know enough about jazz as music, obviously, but I do know that jazz was heavily appropriated by white Europeans and different categories of Europeans, if I also want to follow both race scholarship and your take on peripheries as well. So in that heavy appropriation and colonizing, a lot of the original narratives were erased, and even those who originally made jazz music as some sort of resistance. So I wondered if you maybe could talk a little bit about that, how jazz was used to create new peripheries and erase the origins of Black movements and Black movements for liberation and Black musicians. And then I also was wondering, when you are talking about the musicians in Europe that are sort of identity-wise being peripheral wherever they go to, what are those peripheries you were talking about in a racial sense? I think of Charles Mill's book, Racial Contract, where he talks about how, people from what we would call Southeastern Europe today, or Eastern Europe, or even Portugal that you've mentioned that you come from, were sort of sub-white categories, under-white. And so the racial hierarchy even existed among white populations ever since, 15th century or so, or ever since the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So I was just wondering if your analysis could also add on the racial component, because it seems extremely important, especially talking about peripheries that are not just geographical. And then again, in terms of dealing with the European appropriation and colonizing history. Thanks.
No,
Sorry if this was complicated.
No, great question. It needs a book to be replied, but I'll try. So I'll probably start with contextualizing jazz studies, where they are now. So Jasna and I, we're both part of a generation which belongs to what we call new jazz studies. What happened before that, so until mid-90s, was that jazz studies was very much following the study of classical music with different movements, periods in time, and a very strict narrative, and very much linked with biographies more than challenging issues and social connections. So new jazz studies, what the big difference is that we are challenging those narratives. So we want to understand what's behind those narratives. For instance, racial relations, creating cultural ghettos within the narrative of certain movements. And yes, that happened a lot. So, for instance, those who wrote about jazz until, I would say, the 1960s, late 1960s, they were all white, male, middle-aged. And I have nothing against middle-aged white men. I'm one myself, but you know, they were not part of the community, and they were at first only Europeans. America saw that, in fact, that Europeans were writing about jazz as a way of sort of authenticating jazz as their music, as something that was even being studied by Europeans. But they were doing so in a way that it was very close to the way you listen about classical music, for instance. And then the 1960s, yes, there was a movement, especially with African-American authors, trying to look into jazz in a different way. And today we still have, especially in America, not so much so in Europe, a very big gap between what some will call Eurologic and others will call African logic jazz. So you've got the Eurologic jazz, which is very much within the canons of European music. And that includes not only the aesthetics of the music, but also the narratives around the music. And then you've got Eurological narratives, which have to do with the aesthetics of, let's say, sub-Saharan African music, which, for instance, doesn't have a tension and a release in the harmony, that the rhythm is much more prevailing, but also in the way we approach the history of that music, which is much more based in the community, in the story of the community, than in individuals. So that gap still exists in America, and Jasna spoke about Rhythm Changes, the conference, which exists, it's every 18 months, I think, yeah. And we see that, the researchers that come from the States, they're much more focused in racial issues than the European, because that's also very present in their society. It is very present in our society. We just decide to ignore it. But as you said, and now linking to the your second question, yes, there's still, and in my practice, I saw that, I must say, there's a certain curiosity about the fact that I'm from Portugal, which is not the most obvious place where you would come if you're a jazz musician, the same with Jasna. So there's a certain interest and curiosity. And I realized that in my negotiation of my identity, I would have to try to challenge the notion of exoticism, this idea that I was something exotic, because exotic means someone from the outside. And I didn't want to be from the outside. I want to be part of that community. So when I speak about negotiating identities, it also has to do with that, with negotiating the way we can to a certain extent, challenge the way the others conceive you culturally. And as you said, still today, when everything that I apply to here in the UK, the first thing they ask me is if I'm white, if I'm British white, if I'm Irish white, if I'm European white, or if I'm other white. So it's like there's a whole kind of hierarchy for how white you are, or where you exactly come from, which yeah, it might be interesting in statistical terms, but not very welcoming. There's someone with a hand.
I think Emina had a follow-up question in the chat for a second, if you want to address that before I ask mine.
It was kind of a joke too. What do you say when someone asks you what white person you are?
Oh, I'm usually other white. There's nothing much to go there. But
Yeah.
Europe is also very interesting in that regard, because Portugal is part of the Iberian Peninsula with Spain. And one of the things, and I before the meeting, I was saying, Jasna and Tina, how happy I was that they were pronouncing, and by the way, all of you are pronouncing my name right, José, because people assume that I'm Spanish and they'll go with Jose, or as I was presented once here in a jazz festival, Iaze. So it's very difficult for them to understand. So on one hand, I feel Iberian. Yes, I'm from the Iberian Peninsula, but then there's so much history, and the Serbian and the Croats have an even more recent history. There's so much history there that it's hard to negotiate exactly what you want to be and how you want to present yourself. We hate the Spanish so much, but at the same time, we respect them so much that it's this sort of love-hate relationship, a bit like the British and the American. The British, they really love America. They really love America, but they hate them at the same time. They think they're tacky, they're too loud, and so on and so on. So this sort of love relationship, I think that says a lot about our cultural relationships. But I'm sure that your question meant a follow-up. No. No.
So Augie, did you want to raise a question?
Yeah, it went in a completely different direction, so I just wanted to let Emina go back to hers if she wanted. So yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'm also trained as an ethnographer, and I found a lot of it interesting. And I particularly wanted to ask you about this aspect of participatory or collaborative research. How do you, let's say, set parameters for what the outcome of the research is going to be? Are the people that you are collaborating with kind of giving you input on, these are the things that you as an academic can offer us, this is what we would like you to produce as an outcome of your project? Like, how do you negotiate that practical aspect of what the research project will end up being as a publication or as a film or whatever else it may be? Thank you.
Oh, that's really interesting, and something that I pose myself constantly. To which extent can you sort of negotiate that? Negotiation seems to be the word today. But how much can you negotiate that? Should you leave that to the participants? But again, there's also ethical issues and issues of ownership, which is another problem. So in the arts, in the artistic practice, one of the main issues is, so I do a performance based on what I get from the community. Does that performance belong to me or to the community? Who are the rightful owners of that performance? So, and I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. I guess I had the concept, I structured the information in that way, but does that make me the rightful owner of that performance, of that information? And through art, we believe that we also produce knowledge. So am I the owner of that knowledge? So that's a debate that is very much ongoing now. You were asking something slightly different, which is how do you agree what kind of format the performance, for instance, has, right? Is this a film? Is this, well, I've worked with in both cases where I told my participants, listen, we're going to do this and we're going to do this together. And I specified exactly what we're going to do. And I also went the other way where everything was created from scratch. And to my profound sadness, they decided to leave music out of it. But I respected that, and they wanted to go just with poetry. Now I'm preparing a project with Stavanger in Norway, where we exploring post-industrial spaces that have become arts hubs. And what we're going to do then is, so it's Coventry and Stavanger. Coventry, the hub used to be a radiator factory for cars, of course. And in Stavanger, a big brewery. Sounds interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with people who used to work there, with their descendants, with migrants in those cities, because there's a big increase in Stavanger and Coventry, with students and so on. And in that specific case, we decided that we're going to do sound installations, but that the movement of the visitors within the installation would trigger different responses and different configurations of the sound. So in a way, we're trying to get to a point where our framework is sort of minimal, because the result will be a decision made by the participants, in this case, the visitor. I don't know if this answers to your question, but yeah, it's a difficult one. It's a very tricky one.
I have the last question, if I can go. Yeah, thank you so much, José, for the great presentation. I would like to kindly ask you if you can elaborate a bit more on how has being in a non-traditional jazz location influenced your own musical approach, and which are some of the different characteristics you or other musicians that are from these geographically peripheral areas that you mentioned have introduced. If you can share a bit more on that, would be nice.
So it's what differentiates me as a Portuguese musician from, for instance,
let's say from the traditional jazz locations to the non-traditional, the geographically peripheral areas that you mentioned.
Okay, that's really interesting, because one of the things that I also found out during my research is that if you are an American jazz musician, you have the weight of history on your back. So a bit like the previous question about racial issues, if you're a white American musician, you have a ton of weight on your back, because there's that idea that in a way they took someone else's tradition. If you're an African American jazz musician, you also have a big weight on your back, which is, this is my culture. I need to defend this. When we come to Europe, there's two things that are very important to take into account. The first is what happened in World War II, because jazz really started to spread in Europe when the American soldiers stayed in the UK. So here in the UK, for instance, you have trad jazz, traditional jazz, and you've got free jazz. There's almost nothing in between. So, and the trad jazz fans and musicians say, this is the real jazz. This is the jazz we got from the Americans when they were here. And then there's free jazz, which is a bit more experimental, and which takes some European elements of contemporary music, where we challenge structures and so on. And within that, to answer your question, as a Portuguese, for instance, Portugal has this beautiful music genre called fado, which is sort of the Portuguese blues. And wherever I go, people are trying to understand if there's a bit of fado in there. Like with all the Spanish, they're trying to understand if there's a bit of flamenco in there. With all the French, they're trying to understand if there's a bit of gypsy jazz there, manouche. So these aspects are almost like stigmas, and part of the fun of being a jazz musician, being a researcher in jazz, is when you play with this, and again you challenge those notions. But yeah, there are stigmas associated to people coming from different parts of the world and how they perform jazz, and then you can apply that to how they speak English and how they, you know, there are very prevalent stigmas, and the funny thing is that you can sort of challenge that. I don't know if this.
Yeah.
Can I add to this something? I have this, if that's okay, it just takes 2 minutes. So just to this question and what José was saying, I'm now this summer doing this research at the Blinken Archivum in Budapest. That's the biggest archivum. They have Central European University on regime of media content in Hungary, in Budapest during the Cold War, during the Russians. So I'm doing now the research. I'm comparing how jazz developed during these times, like 50s, 60s, and 70s in ex-Yugoslavia countries, which was socialist at that time, and it was very open to American culture and music. And on the other side, at the same time, Hungary, who was under Russians, and jazz was seen as a enemy's music. So now I'm comparing how these two jazz practices developed in the same time in Yugoslavia and Hungary. They are neighboring countries, right? So because jazz was not allowed in Hungary, it was kind of political resistance. It was sign of political resistance. Jazz was played in garages, and it was illegal. No one could hear. They didn't have any shows on radio. It was censored, so Russian just played Russian jazz on radios. While in Yugoslavia, in the same time, we were super open. You know, from Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, everybody was coming, and we were listening to their music. And so how these two practices developed today in Serbia and in Balkan, well, in ex-Yugoslavia, we mostly have mainstream jazz. It's very American wannabe. We didn't develop really nothing like own practice. We never had avant-garde jazz in Yugoslavia. Even today, it's only or mainstream or ethno jazz using traditional elements. On the other side, in Hungary, because it was kind of resistance, it was illegal, they had to develop their own practice, not copying, not mirroring American culture. So now today, Hungarian avant-garde jazz and Polish avant-garde jazz in the same way is one of the most specific and authentic European jazz practice. This is just an example. I don't know if that's interesting. So I'm thinking that we are coming to the end. And José, thank you very much for your presentation and all your answers, and everybody for getting involved. That's it from me. I don't know, Tina, if you want to close the event.
Yes, I just want to thank you once again to our guest, José. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you all. See you next week, also on Thursday at 5 p.m. And that's it. Thank you. Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.